Well, hello, and welcome to our Luke Bible class. Glad that you're tuned in to this video and are going to be able to participate with us in our study here today. We're going to be in Luke 22, starting in verse 47. I'll go ahead and mention again the fact that there is a study sheet available if you'd like to look at that. You may have already done so. If not, you may want to pause the video and go to the church's Facebook page or the class's group page. It's located in both of those locations. You can just look over that, and maybe that'll help us get into our study here today. We are going to look at this again. This is this is class 21 in this series. We're getting close to the end, and of course, we're reaching the climax of the ministry and the work of Jesus and what he came to this earth to accomplish. And it is at the same time very thrilling to study these things. It's disturbing to study them, knowing who Jesus is and how he is getting ready to be treated by humanity. That's troubling, but also it is so encouraging to know that Jesus, because of his love for us, willingly did the things that he did, subjected himself to the things that he subjected himself. Now, as we get into this, we are at a point in our study where all of these things are happening in quick succession, especially when you compare that to the rest of the account of the ministry of Jesus, where there could be long stretches of time between events and those kinds of things. But here, this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and it can be difficult to find a good stopping point. And we kind of ran into that in our last study, where we looked at Jesus as he is in the upper room with his disciples for the observance of the Passover, and there also then he establishes the Lord's Supper. He does quite a bit of teaching there. He does. He acknowledges the fact of his betrayal and says that the one who would betray him is right there, although he doesn't name Judas by name. Judas does leave. And interesting that the other apostles seemed oblivious to that. They didn't catch on to what was being said and the indication of that. Peter is identified as one who would deny Jesus, and then Peter denies that he would ever deny Jesus. So you look at the other accounts of this evening and the events, and there are a lot of other things that happen. Luke, by comparison to the other gospel accounts, is more streamlined at this point in Jesus' story. He doesn't spend as much time as do the others in recording the things that are taking place. But he has been in the upper room with them. They leave there and they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. Again, Luke's account is the briefest of all of the Gospels about what happens there. He tells us that Jesus goes further into the garden, although he does tell us that this was a customary place for Jesus to come. But he goes further into the garden. He tells us about Jesus praying. There seems to be indication that it's not just the one brief prayer that Luke records, but he doesn't tell us that it's 3 times and that each time he comes back and finds apostles sleeping. He does tell us about the agony of Jesus as he prayed, and the blood as great drops of sweat or come from Jesus' face as he is praying. He tells about the angel that is sent to minister to Jesus in the garden here as he is praying. And after that last time that Jesus prays there, he comes back to find the apostles again sleeping, asking them, "Why are you sleeping?" encouraging them to pray that they not enter into temptation. And it's while he is speaking then that the next thing happens. And that's where we broke this off last week, at the end of verse 47, starting in verse 46, and starting now in verse 47. While he was speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. Again, not nearly the detail that we find in other places. This crowd was apparently a rather sizable crowd. We don't know the number of them. We find out from other gospel accounts that the Roman cohort was a part of this. Now, cohort numbers about 600, and I don't necessarily think that we're to believe that the entire cohort was a part of this group, but Roman soldiers were a part of this. There were the high priests, their servants, there were temple officials, there were these leading Jews in Jerusalem who came and were a part of this. There were others that were there. They were armed to the hilt. They had torches. And you could just imagine what they were thinking in that they were going to come and they were going to apprehend Jesus. They could very well have expected that this was going to turn into a manhunt. That is, that Jesus would try to flee and hide, and here they are on this side of the Mount of Olives, and it might take quite a bit of effort and quite a bit of people, quite a number of people to find this man. They may have thought that his disciples may try to present somebody else to them as Jesus, and that would give him time to escape. They might have thought there was going to be resistance and there was going to be a fight that would ensue. We don't know exactly what all they thought, but you probably would agree that they didn't expect things to play out the way they ended up playing out when this crowd comes. This mob, I think, is a fair way to describe them, coming to apprehend Jesus. And the one who is leading them there to the place to identify the one who they were after was, of course, Judas. And he drew near to Jesus to kiss him, because that was going to be the sign. And Jesus said to him, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" A couple of things here. Number one is that Judas was identified by the phrase, he was one of the 12. And it's interesting that the only other apostle who is ever identified as being that explicitly as one of the 12 was Thomas. But Judas is more than once identified that way. And probably, I would guess, that the reason for that is to give emphasis to and to highlight the treachery of this man. That this one who was one of the 12 would do this, and yet, of course, that's exactly what he does do. And the identification of Jesus was going to be carried out by this kiss. One of the things about that is it's nighttime. There are a lot of people here. There are no doubt many of these who are here who have come to apprehend Jesus who may not know him by sight at all. There was a need for this positive identification. This is the one. And so Judas's kiss fulfilled that. But then also the fact that he would betray him with a kiss. A kiss was not an uncommon greeting at all, even among men, in that it was simply a show of respect and admiration. It was a show of honor, friendship, had so many positive connotations to it, and yet that was what was chosen as the sign, and the moment of betrayal, if you will, was that kiss. And so Jesus' question is a rather haunting one. Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And of course, he would, and he did. Now, Luke then tells us that those who were around him, the apostles, saw what was happening. This no doubt caught them by complete surprise. Despite what Jesus has been telling them and warning them, they didn't see this coming. And so when they saw this happening, they asked, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword? Do you want us to defend you? Should we defend you?" There was that discussion in the upper room, and Luke tells us about this, that Jesus had told them, remember when you were sent out before, You didn't take a money bag. You didn't take anything with you. Everything was provided for you. Now I'm telling you, take your money bag, take your knapsack, take your cloak, or if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy a sword. And so maybe that thought was still in their minds, but at the end of that discussion, remember, they said, well, look, Lord, here we have 2 swords. He said, it's enough. And so now they're ready to take those swords. More like a dagger is what we're talking about here. The term that's used to describe these weapons is more like a dagger. But, okay, Lord, we're ready to fight. And maybe it is that the apostles recognized they were hugely outnumbered here, and they were outgunned, as it were. But they had seen Jesus do some pretty remarkable things, and were thinking that, well, we need to at least try this. And one of the apostles doesn't wait for an answer to that. He immediately takes one of those daggers, one of those swords, and he strikes the servant of the high priest and cuts off his right ear. We learn from other places the identities of both of these individuals. The man's name is Malchus, and the apostle who did the striking with the sword is Peter. And you think about having a sword and you're swiping it at somebody and you cut off their ear. Now, either that person is going to have to be holding very still, and the one cutting is going to have to be expert at his swordsmanship, which is not going to be true of this fisherman from Galilee. You know, he was looking to do some serious damage here, and probably Malchus ducked or moved or whatever he did, and the end result was he loses his ear in all of this. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he is going to then touch that ear, and he's going to heal him. He's going to restore that ear back to the man's head and be healed with that. Now, in that, Jesus says no more of this. That apparently that phrase is a little bit challenging to translate, to know exactly what it was Jesus was saying. And the evidence of a couple of different ways that might be understood is found here, in that the English Standard Version says Jesus saying no more of this. Okay, telling no, we're not going to fight. We're not going to do it this way. And that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Jesus didn't want his disciples fighting. You know, during a part of his trial, as we'll see later, Jesus is going to say, my kingdom is not of this world. And one of the evidences of that fact that Jesus gave was, or else my disciples would fight. But they're not fighting. That's the point. And he doesn't want them fighting here. Now, another way that can be translated, some of you may be reading from and use the New King James Version in your study, and the phrases there translated, permit even this. And while I think we could understand either one of those approaches to translating this phrase as, fitting very well, the point would be different, in that Jesus is saying to the apostles here, stop it, don't do this. And then the other phrase is, we have to allow this to happen. And I think that very much is a part of what's going on here. What we're seeing here, as we've come to the garden, and Jesus has agonized in prayer before the Father, pleading. Blood is coming from his brow. There is so much stress and agony, and heaven sends an angel to minister to Jesus and to strengthen him. This is a point of a critical point of crisis. And Jesus, up to this point in time, every time has been successful in fending off those who would try to derail him or destroy him, who would try to get the best of him. Nobody could ever do that, and nobody would ever do that. But Jesus has prayed to God, and has the crux of that prayer ends up being, Father, whatever your will is, and what God's will is for Jesus to give himself over to this. The only reason why he is able to be apprehended is that he allows it to happen. And so I think we could see that in the wording, permit even this. Let this happen. Jesus has reached that point of saying this is how this has to play out. You might remember back, there were 3 times that Jesus predicted and told what was going to happen when they finally got to Jerusalem. And in one of those, this one in particular, I think I wrote this down. Yes, it's in verse 44 of chapter 9. Jesus says that he would be delivered into the hands of men. And that's exactly what's happening here. He's being delivered into the hands of men. Not because they're more powerful, not because they're able to get the upper hand, but because Jesus allows himself for that to be done to him. And so, Jesus stops their efforts at violence to try to defend him, and he heals the man. Miracle, but it doesn't seem to really register with people what Jesus just did, and the fact that he could do that, and what does that say about him? None of that is mentioned at all here. And so Jesus says to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? There we get the first indication from Luke about how well armed these people are. And you've come out this way against me? I was in the temple every day, Jesus said, and you could have laid hands on me, but it is now that you come out this way to get me. And Jesus is offering no resistance. And then he says this, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. Jesus is allowing for darkness to have its way. He's allowing it to happen. And that is a remarkable thing to think about, Jesus' willingness to do that. And so they seize him, beginning verse 54, and they lead him away and bring him into the high priest's house. So we're in the middle of the night. Jesus is apprehended by this mob. They come back into the city of Jerusalem. So many things that Luke doesn't tell us. That it was at that point that the disciples, the apostles, they just flee, they run, they hide. They are fearful for their own well-being and their safety. And so Jesus is left to be taken by this group. And the place they take him to, is the house of the high priest. Now, what's a little bit confusing is the fact that there were actually 2 high priests. There was the official high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and then his father-in-law, who was Annas. And this was an interesting phenomenon at the time in that the Romans reserved the right for the appointment and the removal of the high priest. And of course, the Jews, although they submitted to that, they had their own thinking and their own ideas about who really ought to be serving as high priest. And so you had from the standpoint of Rome, who the high priest was, but then just kind of on a practical level from the thinking of the people and whom they recognized and whom they respected, you had Annas. And not that these 2 were in opposition to each other, but you just had this dual high priest going on. That's why when, during this week leading up to what's going on now, remember it was the chief priests, plural, and scribes who took the lead in trying to bring Jesus down. And what actually happens here when we take the other gospel accounts is that they go first to the house of Annas and then to the house of Caiaphas. And it is believed that these men lived in what was kind of like a family compound in the city of Jerusalem, where their houses probably were in very close proximity to each other with this courtyard area around the houses themselves. But again, Luke, very streamlined in what he's telling us, simply says they go to the high priest's house, because what he's going to tell us about here is that Peter is following at a distance. And when he comes, there's a fire that's built in the courtyard, and the people are sitting around it, warming themselves, and Peter sits among them, and he begins to be identified by different people as one of those followers of Jesus. And we know that there are 3 times that that Peter is identified as such, and 3 times Peter denies that, even to the point of cursing and vowing that he knows nothing of the man, has nothing to do with the man. When all 4 gospel accounts tell about Peter's denial, the details of it as given are a little different, and I think there's easy explanation of the differences. Sometimes it seems as though different people have the first, second, and third questioning, and then the first, second, and third denial. To think that there were only 3 people who asked that question, either to Peter directly or among themselves, I think would be kind of foolish. If someone brought that up, then a lot of attention is directed at Peter, and it's not hard to imagine others saying, yeah, you are one of those Galileans who were with this man. And the fact that he is a Galilean is readily recognizable to people. Galileans, the way we would say it today is they had a very distinctive accent. And if a Galilean spoke, you knew it was a Galilean. And so if Peter opened his mouth and started talking, people would know that he was such. So the identifying of Peter as a Galilean, as a follower of Jesus, one of the gospel accounts even tells us that one of the ones who identifies him as such and questions him about his association with Jesus is a relative of the high priest servant whom Peter has, cut off his ear that Jesus healed. So you have these questions asked of Peter. We mentioned this last week, that we can understand, I think, Peter in the context and in the setting of the upper room saying, I will never deny you. I will never forsake you. Even to the point of death, I won't do that. Well, that's in a very supportive circumstance with people around you who would support that sentiment, and they themselves even have expressed the same thing had they been given opportunity. But now, very different circumstance. He's alone. He's by himself. And he is not nearly so bold or brave. And it's easy to be critical of Peter, because Peter makes some pretty big mistakes. And this is probably the worst of them that we're aware of. But I want you to think about this in regard to Peter. And we've mentioned something to this effect before, and that is that where are the other apostles? Now, there is indication in John's gospel that the apostle John is also present here. Don't know if he's present at that moment in time, but he was also one who came because there was some friendship between the family of John and the family of the high priest. But nevertheless, Peter was there. He followed Jesus to this point. There was a desire on the part of Peter to be with Jesus. He was the one who, out on the Sea of Galilee in the storm, asked Jesus to call him, to walk to him on the water. And Peter did that. Well, another one of Peter's big mistakes, he begins to sink, and Lord, save me. But Peter wanted to be with Jesus. And when Jesus thinks about that night and his being on trial and being in the hands of evil and wicked men, and he thinks about the 12 and where were they? Well, one of them was there. One of them had followed. One of them had come to where Jesus was. And That's pretty powerful. There is much to be admired in Peter, and there is much connection, I think, that we can make with Peter, even in his grave mistakes that he makes. And he does deny even knowing Jesus. And this is one of the most poignant scenes to me in all of Scripture. And when that third time he says, "Man, I do not know what you're talking about," immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and he looked at Peter. We don't know how they were positioned in such a way that Peter in the courtyard and Jesus in the house of the high priest. But anyway, when that happened, Jesus turns and looks at Peter, and Peter turns and their eyes meet. And just imagine the emotion of that moment for both Peter and for Jesus. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you'll deny me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. You can imagine, but you can only imagine. Wow. What a scene. What a scene. Well, we continue on. The men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. So while Jesus is apprehended, he's there at the house of the high priest. Probably temple guards are the ones who are holding on to Jesus here. They're guarding him. They're holding him in custody. And they take advantage of the situation and they begin to mock Jesus. They blindfold him and, so who is it that struck you? They prophesy. They do many other horrible things against him. And you might remember again, back when Jesus told his apostles, okay, we're going to go to Jerusalem and here's what's going to happen. And among those things, in chapter 9 and verse 22, he said he must suffer many things. Well, this is certainly among the things that Jesus had to suffer, and he knew he did. And the third time that Jesus prophesied what was going to happen in Jerusalem, he talked about how he would be mocked, shamefully treated, and spit upon. And so here it is. These are the Jews who are doing this to him, those who are holding him, and they are blaspheming him. It is a tragic irony that the very thing that Jesus is going to wind up being charged with, worthy of death from the Jewish standpoint, is that he blasphemed. And here they are doing that very thing. They are blaspheming the Son of God. And it's hard to imagine what that scene was like and what Jesus was going through, and to remember why he was going through it. So when day came, this is verse 66, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council. I want to stop there. Again, Luke doesn't tell us many of the things that we learn from the other gospel accounts. In the night, before day, some of the Sanhedrin are called, and they come to the house of Annas, apparently, or rather Caiaphas. And there is this nighttime portion of the trial. This is a part of the trial of Jesus that's illegal. These nighttime court sessions were not permissible. I mean, it was against the law to even do that kind of thing. And yet here they were doing it. And you can't even call it a trial, because in a trial the effort is to come to a conclusion based on evidence that is presented and then a verdict given based on all of that. Well, they had the verdict before they ever started. So they came together for the purpose of trying to find witnesses that could corroborate and they had trouble doing that, didn't they? That they could be witnesses against Jesus for the very thing that they wanted to charge him with. But that was all determined ahead of time. And so this is just such a mockery of any semblance of justice whatsoever. So this is all taking place at night at the house of Caiaphas. And then when day came, Jesus is brought before the council, the Sanhedrin. He's brought before the Sanhedrin. So this is really the official part of Jesus' trial from the Jewish standpoint. He's going to be brought before the Sanhedrin. They already have the verdict determined. They already have witnesses lined up to try to have something to accuse him of, and they had trouble doing that. But they bring him before these men and say, "If you are the Christ, tell us." Okay, that's the question. And again, they're not there examining Jesus, and no defense is able to be given. They just ask him a question. Are you the Christ? And he says, if I tell you, you will not believe. We've noted this all the way through the ministry of Jesus, the understanding and expectation of the Jewish people for what the Messiah was going to be like, what he was going to accomplish, how he would go about doing what he came to do. All of those things. The Jewish people had an idea that was so foreign to what the actual role of the Messiah was to be, that Jesus could hardly just tell them yes, because they had in their minds what the Messiah would be. He knew he was the Messiah, and he went about his ministry exactly like the prophet said the Messiah would go about his ministry and his work. So if I tell you, you won't believe, and if I ask you, you won't answer. If we tried to reach clarification on this about my true identity, and Jesus often asked questions, didn't he? That was one of the methods that Jesus used to try to teach and to help people come to understanding. And we remember the occasion where Jesus was challenged just a few days prior to this about by what authority was he doing the things that he was doing, and that was in response to his having cleansed the temple. And Jesus said, I'll give you an answer if you'll give me an answer. And he asked them about the baptism of John and the ministry of John. Was that from heaven or from men? And they refused to answer. Well, Jesus knew that about these men. So if I ask you, you won't answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. So they all said, are you the Son of God? And he said to them, you say that I am. And they said, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips. What they heard from the lips of Jesus was what to their minds constituted blasphemy, that he was claiming to be the very Son of God, which indeed was true, and which indeed Jesus laid claim to, and he spent his whole ministry demonstrating that fact, that was exactly who he was. And yet they had one purpose in mind for this portion of Jesus' trial, and that was to lay a charge against him worthy of death. Now, there's going to be another phase to this trial, and that's what we'll pick up with in chapter 23. Because what they're looking for is a way that they might charge him to the Romans, bring a charge against him before the Romans, so the Romans would condemn him to death. That's what they're trying to get to achieve the purpose that they have. But for them, and from their perspective, blasphemy would do the trick as far as they were concerned, and they could proceed forward with this. And so we've come to that point. Jesus' trial is going to continue, and we'll pick up with that study as we continue in chapter 23, and we will take that through. I believe we'll go through verse 25 of chapter 23 in our next study as the trial of Jesus comes to a head then this next day. So I hope you're able to be a part of that study with us. And we'll look forward to that time together. Thank you for being here for this study today.